When I came back from study abroad, people asked me for stories, and what they didn't ask for was a complicated answer. But it's this complicated answer that matters, and what I want to talk to you about. So I have 3 stories for you today, and they're all about power. They're about power and the complicated ways that we are all implicated in it. Now this matters because we make power. It doesn't just happen by accident. The stories we tell, the words that we use, and the ways that we repeatedly interact with each other all create power. And if you're a white Westerner, then it probably favors you. Now, I know that in this short time, I can't unravel all of the complexity. And I can't give you a history lesson of Tanzania, but what I can do is give you some stories that make you think about how you make power and how you're implicated in it. And I'm with you here today trying to deconstruct how I am implicated in power too, which means that this is a task of sensitivity as well as of storytelling. So my first story begins with me getting ready to go to Tanzania last semester. And I was packing my bag to the brim with bug spray and sunscreen, and I bought this little safari hat that made me look like a Gap baby model. Thank you. And I kept batting away all these comments that my family made about Tanzania being corrupt and dangerous. Now, I knew this wasn't the right image to have in mind, but there was a seed of fear in me, and I didn't know what the right image to have in mind was. I knew this wasn't it. Now, I know I had a very inexperienced, ignorant, and even hypocritical notion of what Tanzania would be like. But nonetheless, I was determined to go so that I could unlearn some things. Now, I'd like to point out that when you come from a family where traveling isn't a common thing, and when you don't have the means to travel all the time, when you study abroad, it's as if your whole family's with you. You're bringing back lessons for them. So this whole process has been a process of unlearning for my entire family. I'd also like to point out what a privilege it is to just go to a place because you want to learn about it. That kind of access is power. So what I mean by power is the ability to affect and influence other people. It's a type of freedom. It's a freedom to shape and affect the thoughts of other people. Now, my image of Tanzania was constructed by a type of power. It's a Western narrative that through aid commercials and other means portrays African countries as places that need all the time. This leaves no room for Africans to be givers themselves, to be creators, to be empowered, or to be rich. Narratives that Africans possess all the same social issues or cultures are disempowering narratives. They erase the immense diversity across the entire continent. So, I have a question for you. Who is writing those commercials and those books and those songs that make us think about African countries as uncomplicated places? Who is writing them, and for whose benefit? Because I can pretty much guarantee you that they weren't written by Africans. Now, the ability to construct how people think about each other, even an entire continent, that is power. Now to my second story. a story of actually being in Tanzania. So the best way that I can describe my overall experience is as if you imagine that you're in the middle of a very large spider web. And you can feel that you're caught in something. You wiggle around a little bit and something moves over here and moves you. But you can't actually see what it is you're caught in. You can only feel it. Now, the thing that I was caught in, this web, was power. And each strand was a power dynamic between me and another person. What I'm about to tell you is a story of power, and I'd like you to reflect on this web. Keep in mind that if you've never been to Tanzania, this is not a story of every Tanzanian ever. I don't want to do the same erasure that I just talked about. So I'm bringing you this story with care for how complex it is. One day, we went to visit a school in Mwera. We thought we were going to meet our host siblings and learn about Tanzania's educational system. But when we walked into the classroom, there were a bunch of Tanzanian officials in suits up at the front. And our Tanzanian professor, she stood up and she said, "This is a cultural exchange. They're going to ask you some questions, and you can ask them some questions." Now, the first question they asked us was, "What advice do you have to give to our school? We know that American schools are doing better, so what advice do you have to give us?" Not a single one of us was comfortable answering that question. We didn't think for a second that we had the authority to tell these Tanzanian officials how to run their school. None of us were educators. And most importantly, none of us were Tanzanian. But because we were from the US, it was expected that we had some ability to help them figure out some of their educational challenges. If not with our ideas, then with our money. And the room was heavy with tension. We all looked at each other. And I raised my hand nervously, and I said, "American schools have a variety of problems if you want to hear about it." Now, my idea was that this was a cultural exchange. This was not a best practices exchange. This wasn't a consultation. I wanted to rebalance the power dynamic. So I said that in the US, many students are deprived of an education. That students who are wealthy and most often white are the ones who are receiving benefits much, much more. That students and teachers are both struggling. Now, this answer, which at first my professor refused to translate, was met with a lot of disgruntled looks, and someone even laughed. I could spend the rest of my time on this story and the complicated web of power that's underneath it. Just think for a second about the implication of Western 20-year-olds being seen as experts on Tanzanian schools. That is power. And that is power that was handed down to me from a history of Western people who exploited and dominated the ancestors of the people right in front of me. There is power, too, in being able to walk away from that and forgive myself because I'm young and the subject was tricky. There's power, too, in being able to orchestrate a cultural exchange, as my Tanzanian professor did. There was power exerted by her tapping into that sense of obligation that she knows Westerners have to save strangers, particularly African strangers. She knew that. She used that. That is power. Now, my third story is a story about being back here from Tanzania. It's about talking to you all today, actually. I wrote so many drafts of this, and I frequently spiraled because I would deconstruct every word I said. It felt like every word and every story carried too much power. And I didn't want to hurt anyone with this power. I didn't want to misrepresent anyone. What if I added to the image of Tanzania as a place of desperate humanitarian need? In the story I just told you, Africans, Tanzanians, were asking for help. How is that image any different from an aid commercial? But in this story, it is complicated and it is tense. It is not a feel-good story, but it is a feeling story. This is a story of two groups of people with distinctly different histories and relationships to power, confronting what it is they owe to each other and why they are there in the first place. Everyone is processing their confusion, their frustration, and even the absurdity of the situation and their position in it. I'm still living in this third story. I'm still living in some confusion and some frustration. But I want to end by talking about what it is we do with this type of confusion and this type of frustration. Whether you've studied abroad or not doesn't matter. If we really want to connect to one another better, if we really want to help each other, if we really want to make decisions that don't oppress other people, we have to keep deconstructing power. We have to keep questioning why it is we make the decisions we do, why it is we interact with each other in the ways that we do. Once you start to see that every interaction you have is a web of histories, of words which carry ideas about people, of feeling, then it becomes possible to adjust how we interact, to adjust the stories we've been told. Now, this talk for me will never be over. I want to do the work to be sensitive to others and to my identity and my responsibility to it. I want to leave you with some questions to help you deconstruct power. And I've been thinking about them regarding Tanzania. Is your adventure coming at the expense of the well-being of another person? Who counts as an authority? What does your word choice imply? Why are you uncomfortable? I hope you'll take these stories as good places to start your own conversations about power. This is a necessary conversation. I hope you consider some of these stories and some of these questions. Thank you.